Li Wei parked her 10-year-old Honda Civic in front of the community garden and grabbed her worn gardening gloves from the passenger seat. The car had seen better days, with a small dent on the rear bumper and paint starting to fade in patches, but it ran well and served its purpose. Li saw no reason to replace something that worked perfectly fine. That was the philosophy she lived by: practical, modest, and without unnecessary luxuries. The morning sun warmed her face as she walked through the garden gate. Several regulars waved and called out greetings. Li had been volunteering here every Tuesday and Thursday morning for the past 3 years, helping elderly neighbors tend to their plots and teaching children from the nearby elementary school about growing vegetables. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen," called out an elderly man carefully watering his tomato plants. "Those herbs you suggested are keeping the bugs away. My tomatoes have never looked better." Li smiled warmly. "I'm glad they're working, Mr. Park. My grandmother taught me that trick when I was just a little girl." She stopped to examine his plants, gently turning a leaf to check its underside. "Yes, very healthy. You'll have a wonderful harvest this year." What the friendly neighbors of Oakwood Heights didn't know, what almost nobody knew, was that Li Wei Chen could have paid someone to tend to her garden. She could have hired a team of professional gardeners for every home on the block, in fact. She could have purchased the entire community garden and the surrounding properties without making a dent in her bank account. Li preferred it that way. The simple life she led wasn't born of necessity but choice. Back at home, Li showered and changed into a plain blue button-up shirt and khaki pants. Her modest 2-bedroom house sat on a quiet street lined with similar homes. From the outside, nothing distinguished it from the others. Average-sized, well-maintained but not flashy, with practical furniture and minimal decorations inside. She brewed herself a cup of tea and sat at the kitchen table, where a stack of paperwork waited. Li ran a small online business selling handcrafted accessories she made herself. What had started as a hobby had grown into a surprisingly successful venture, though she deliberately kept it small and manageable. Her phone buzzed with a message from her husband. Meeting ran late. "We'll be home tomorrow instead. Miss you. Love." H. Li smiled at the message. After 15 years of marriage, Juan still made her heart flutter. Their unusual arrangement might seem strange to others, him traveling constantly for work while she maintained their modest public life, but it suited them perfectly. They had their reasons for the separation, reasons for the simplicity she maintained, and reasons for the careful distinction between their public and private lives. Juan Chen was, by any measure, extraordinarily successful. The investment firm he had built from nothing now managed billions in assets. Financial magazines regularly featured him in their most influential lists. His business acumen was legendary in certain circles, yet most people who knew Li had no idea who her husband was or what he did. They assumed, based on her lifestyle, that he worked a regular job, perhaps in sales or middle management. Li never corrected these assumptions. Their unusual lifestyle had begun as a practical decision. When Juan's business first started taking off, they received unwanted attention, solicitations for money, investment opportunities, even a few concerning incidents that had made them feel unsafe. Together, they had decided that Li would maintain a low profile, living simply while Juan handled the high-pressure business world. Over time, what started as a security measure became a philosophy they both embraced. Li glanced at the kitchen clock. She needed to deposit a check from her online business before the bank closed. The quarterly earnings had been particularly good. Not that she needed the money, but she took pride in her little business. Every penny she earned went into a separate account that she used for community projects and anonymous donations to local causes. She gathered her paperwork, tucked the check into her wallet, and grabbed her keys. The First National Bank branch was just a 10-minute drive away. Li rarely went there in person, preferring online banking for most transactions, but this check was larger than usual and required an in-person deposit. As she drove, Li thought about the community center's leaking roof. The director had mentioned it needed repairs, but the center's budget was tight. Perhaps her business earnings this quarter could cover it. The thought made her smile. These small acts of community support gave her more satisfaction than buying luxury items ever could. Li's phone rang through the car speakers. She pressed the button on her steering wheel to answer. "Hello? Mrs. Chen, this is Dr. Reynolds' office calling to confirm your appointment tomorrow at 2 p.m. "Yes, I'll be there." Thank you for the reminder. Lee made a mental note about the doctor's appointment. Nothing serious, just a routine checkup she'd been putting off. Healthcare was another area where she and Juan maintained their separation. She used local doctors and her own insurance through her small business, rather than the exclusive medical concierge service Juan's company provided its executives. Pulling into the bank parking lot, Lee found a spot near the back. The lot was fairly full. Friday afternoons were always busy with people depositing paychecks before the weekend. She grabbed her purse, locked the car, and walked toward the entrance. The glass doors slid open, revealing a bustling interior. 6 teller windows lined one wall, with 4 currently open and serving customers. A line of about 10 people snaked around the rope barriers. Lee took her place at the end of the line, patient as always. She observed the others waiting. A construction worker still in his dust-covered clothes, an elderly couple leaning on each other, a harried mother trying to keep her toddler entertained. Lee smiled at the little boy when he waved at her, and she waved back, making a funny face that caused him to giggle. These were the moments she cherished, simple human connections. In Juan's world of corporate boardrooms and investment portfolios worth millions, such authentic interactions were rare. Everyone wanted something, had an agenda, or treated each other as stepping stones to greater wealth or influence. Here, in this ordinary bank on an ordinary Friday, Lee was just another customer waiting her turn. The line moved slowly forward. Lee checked her watch. She still had plenty of time before the bank closed. She used the wait to mentally plan the week ahead. The community center needed volunteers for an upcoming food drive. The elementary school had asked if she could help with their garden club again this year, and there was that roof repair to look into. As the line inched forward, Lee noticed a well-dressed bank employee speaking with customers who appeared to have more complex banking needs. The woman wore a name tag identifying her as the branch manager, and she moved with an air of authority, directing people to appropriate desks or handling issues herself. Lee finally reached the front of the line. The electronic sign flashed and directed her to window number 3. She approached the counter where a young teller was finishing up with the previous customer. "Next, please," the teller called without looking up, still organizing cash from the previous transaction. Lee stepped forward, pulled out her identification and the check, and placed them on the counter. The check was for $12,480, a substantial sum for her small business, but nothing extraordinary in banking terms. "I'd like to deposit this to my business account." "Please," Lee said politely. The teller finally looked up, his eyes quickly taking in Lee's simple appearance. Her unstylish clothes, her lack of jewelry beyond a plain wedding band, her practical handbag that was showing signs of wear. Something in his expression shifted subtly. "Business account?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of doubt as he picked up the check. His eyes widened slightly at the amount. "And you are the account holder?" "Yes," Lee replied calmly, sliding her ID and business account card forward. "I've had this account for 5 years now." The teller examined her identification with an intensity that seemed unnecessary. Lee maintained her pleasant expression, accustomed to occasionally being underestimated based on her appearance. Little did the teller know that the unassuming woman standing before him in her simple clothes and worn shoes was about to become the center of an incident that would rock the entire bank. But for now, Lee Wei-Chun waited patiently, as she always did, with no indication that her quiet dignity would soon be so thoroughly tested, or that her response would change everything. The teller at window number 3 frowned as he looked back and forth between Lee's ID card and her face. He was young, perhaps in his mid-20s, with slicked back hair and a crisp collar that looked uncomfortable against his neck. "This account is for Chen's handcrafted accessories," he asked, his tone making it sound more like a challenge than a question. Lee nodded. "Yes, that's my business. I'm the sole owner." The teller's eyes narrowed slightly. "And this check is for $12,480. He said the amount loudly enough that a few people in line turned to look. "That's correct," Lee replied quietly, feeling a flush of embarrassment at the unwanted attention. The teller held the check up to the light, turning it over to examine both sides with exaggerated care. "This is an unusually large deposit for this account," he said, again speaking louder than necessary. "Your normal deposits are much smaller." Lee maintained her composure. "Yes, this was a good quarter. I had several large custom orders. Handcrafted accessories, the teller repeated, emphasizing each word as though testing their truthfulness. And these accessories, they sell for enough to generate this kind of revenue? A few people in line were now openly watching the interaction. The mother with the toddler had pulled her child closer, as though proximity to a potential bank fraud might be dangerous. Yes, Lee answered simply, seeing no need to explain her business model or client base to someone who clearly had already formed judgments about her. The teller tapped at his keyboard, his expression growing more skeptical. I'm seeing some flags in the system. I'll need to get my supervisor to approve this transaction. He didn't lower his voice as he added, We've had several check fraud attempts recently. Lee felt her cheeks grow warm. She knew the check was perfectly legitimate. She knew her business accounts were in excellent standing. Yet here she stood, being treated like a potential criminal because she didn't match this young man's idea of what a successful business owner should look like. I've been banking here for 5 years, she said quietly. I've never had any issues before. The teller ignored her comment and picked up his phone. I need a manager at window 3 for a high-risk transaction approval, he said, emphasizing the words high risk while maintaining eye contact with Lee. People behind her in line began to shift uncomfortably. Some moved to other lines, throwing curious or suspicious glances her way. The elderly couple whispered to each other. The construction worker looked at his watch impatiently. Lee took a deep breath and remained still. She could have mentioned that her husband was Huan Chen, whose investment firm handled transactions thousands of times larger than this modest check. She could have pulled out her phone and, with a few taps, shown bank balances that would have made this teller's eyes widen in shock. But that wasn't her way. She and Juan had agreed long ago to keep their worlds separate for good reasons. The branch manager approached, a tight smile fixed on her face. Her name tag read, Mrs. Thornton, branch manager. She was tall, with carefully styled gray hair and reading glasses hanging from a chain around her neck. What seems to be the problem, Dylan? She asked the teller, not acknowledging Lee. This customer is trying to deposit a check for over $12,000 into a small business account, Dylan explained, handing over Lee's ID and the check. The amount is inconsistent with previous transaction patterns, and the system flagged it as potentially suspicious. Mrs. Thornton examined the check with the same exaggerated scrutiny. Mrs. Chen, is it? Could you explain the source of these funds? The question was asked in a tone that suggested Lee might not have a legitimate answer. By now, nearly everyone in the bank was watching the scene unfold. The security guard near the door had even taken a few steps closer. It's payment for custom orders through my business, Lee explained calmly. I make handcrafted accessories that I sell online and to specialty boutiques. This check represents several months of sales. Mrs. Thornton raised an eyebrow. Handcrafted accessories? Like costume jewelry? Her gaze swept over Lee's simple clothing and practical handbag. Some jewelry, yes. Also leather goods, hand-woven scarves, and specialty items commissioned by clients. Lee kept her voice even, though her heart was beating faster than normal. And this business generates enough income to justify a check of this size? Do you have any additional documentation to verify the source of these funds? Lee reached into her bag and produced her business license and recent tax filing documents. She always came prepared for financial transactions, having learned long ago that people often made assumptions based on appearances. Mrs. Thornton flipped through the papers with obvious skepticism. These seem to be in order, but given the unusual nature of this transaction, we'll need to place a 2-week hold on these funds while we verify the check. A 2-week hold? Lee asked, finally showing a hint of frustration. That's not your standard policy for business accounts. I've never had holds placed on deposits before. Our policies allow for discretionary holds when transactions appear unusual or potentially suspicious, Mrs. Thornton recited, as though reading from a manual. Based on your account history and the nature of this craft business, this deposit falls outside normal patterns. A flush of anger rose in Lee's chest, but she kept her expression neutral. She was being judged purely on how she looked, her modest clothes, her lack of expensive accessories, her unassuming presence. In their eyes, she couldn't possibly be legitimate. Is there someone else I could speak with about this? Lee asked quietly. Mrs. Thornton's smile tightened further. I am the senior manager on duty. If you're uncomfortable with our standard security procedures, perhaps you'd prefer to take your business elsewhere. The challenge in her voice was unmistakable. Several onlookers were now openly staring, One woman in an expensive suit smirked, clearly enjoying the drama. The security guard had moved even closer, positioned just a few feet behind Lee now. Lee felt a moment of genuine humiliation wash over her. In all her years of maintaining her modest lifestyle, she had experienced occasional assumptions and prejudices, but never such open disrespect in a public setting. For a brief moment, she considered walking out, driving home, and asking Juan to handle this when he returned. Instead, she reached for her phone. "I'd like to make a call. If you don't mind," she said with dignity. "Perhaps my husband can provide additional verification." Mrs. Thornton gave a dismissive wave. "By all means. Though I should warn you that third-party verification over the phone doesn't change our hold policy." Lee stepped aside from the window, aware of the stares following her. She found a quiet corner near the loan officer desks and dialed Juan's number. As expected, it went to voicemail. He was likely in his meeting. She left a brief message explaining the situation, then sent a text as backup. At First National Bank on Oak Street. "Having issues with the deposit. Nothing urgent, but could use your help when you're free." Lee returned to the window where Mrs. Thornton and Dylan were huddled together, speaking in low voices. They straightened when they saw her approach. "My husband is currently unavailable," Lee explained. "He's in meetings." "Of course he is," Dylan muttered just loud enough to be heard. Mrs. Thornton shot him a warning look, then turned back to Lee. "As I explained, we'll need to place a hold on these funds. If you'd like to proceed with the deposit under those terms, we can complete the transaction. Otherwise, you're welcome to try another branch or another bank entirely." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. Lee considered her options. She needed the deposit to clear quickly to cover the community center's roof repairs. A 2-week hold would delay the project significantly, potentially causing more damage if it rained again. "I'll proceed with the deposit," Lee finally said, her voice steady despite her frustration. "But I'd like a written explanation of why this hold is being placed, citing the specific bank policies that allow for it." Mrs. Thornton's smile faltered slightly. "That's not something we typically provide. Nevertheless, I'm requesting it," Lee replied firmly. Before Mrs. Thornton could respond, Lee's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced down to see a response from Juan. "Meeting just ended early, on my way. 13 minutes. Lee looked up at Mrs. Thornton with newfound confidence. "On second thought, let's wait a few minutes. My husband will be joining us shortly." "Mrs. Chen, we have other customers waiting," Mrs. Thornton said with forced patience. "We can't hold up a teller window while you wait for someone who may or may not be able to help with the situation. Then perhaps we could continue this discussion in your office," Lee suggested. Mrs. Thornton hesitated, then nodded stiffly. "Very well. Dylan, please direct customers to other windows. Mrs. Chen, follow me." As they walked toward the glass-walled office at the back of the bank, Lee felt the stares of other customers following her. The mother with the toddler quickly looked away when Lee met her eyes. The construction worker shook his head slightly as if disappointed in her. The elderly couple whispered to each other again. In this moment of public shame, with strangers judging her based on assumptions and appearances, Lee held her head high. Little did they know that everything was about to change, and the true nature of Li Wei-chen's circumstances would soon be revealed in a way that none of them, especially Mrs. Thornton and Dylan, would ever forget. Mrs. Thornton's office was small but meticulously organized. Awards and certificates covered one wall, while the other displayed professional photographs of her shaking hands with various bank executives. She gestured for Lee to sit in a chair across from her large desk. "Now, Mrs. Chen," she began, folding her hands on the polished wooden surface. "I understand this situation may be frustrating for you, but I hope you can appreciate that we have procedures in place to protect all our customers." Lee sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap. "I understand the need for security measures, Mrs. Thornton. What I don't understand is why I'm being singled out when I've been a customer here for years with a spotless record." Mrs. Thornton's smile didn't reach her eyes. "We're not singling you out. The system flagged the transaction based on established risk parameters." "And what are those parameters exactly?" Lee asked. "I'm not at liberty to discuss our security algorithms," Mrs. Thornton replied smoothly. "But rest assured they're applied equally to all customers." Lee doubted that very much. She had seen plenty of people in expensive suits walk into this same bank and receive vastly different treatment. She had observed the way staff members practically fell over themselves to assist customers who arrived in luxury cars or flashed designer watches. "My husband will be here shortly," Lee said quietly. "He may be able to provide whatever additional verification you need." Mrs. Thornton glanced at her watch with obvious impatience. "As I mentioned before, Mrs. Chen, having your husband vouch for you won't change our hold policy." The condescension in her voice was unmistakable. Lee suspected that Mrs. Thornton had already formed a mental image of Lee's husband, probably someone as ordinary as Lee herself appeared to be. Perhaps a factory worker or delivery driver, someone who would be equally powerless in this situation. "I believe my husband can help resolve this matter," Lee insisted calmly. Mrs. Thornton sighed. "Very well. While we wait, perhaps you could explain more about this craft business of yours. You mentioned specialty orders?" The question wasn't asked out of genuine interest, but rather as a way to fill time and possibly catch Lee in some inconsistency. Lee recognized the tactic but decided to answer anyway. "Yes, I make handcrafted accessories using traditional techniques I learned from my grandmother. I started with simple pieces sold at local markets, but over time, I developed a reputation for quality work. Now I receive commissions from specialty boutiques and private clients. And these clients pay thousands of dollars for handmade trinkets?" The skepticism in Mrs. Thornton's voice was palpable. Lee smiled slightly. "Some of my pieces incorporate rare materials and take weeks to complete. For certain clients, the value is in the craftsmanship and uniqueness." Before Mrs. Thornton could respond, there was a commotion from the main floor of the bank. Both women turned to look through the glass wall of the office. A man had entered the bank and was speaking to the security guard, who appeared suddenly attentive and respectful. The man was tall and impeccably dressed in a charcoal gray suit that even from a distance was clearly custom-made. His posture exuded quiet confidence, and though his back was to the office, there was something commanding about his presence that had caught the attention of everyone in the bank. The security guard pointed toward Mrs. Thornton's office. The man turned and Lee's face brightened with recognition. "That's my husband," she said simply. Mrs. Thornton looked surprised. This well-dressed man wasn't at all what she had expected. She quickly composed herself and stood. "I'll go speak with him." "That won't be necessary," Lee replied, rising from her chair. "He'll come to us." Indeed, Huan Chen was already walking purposefully across the bank floor. Customers and staff alike seemed to instinctively move out of his way. There was nothing aggressive about his manner, quite the opposite. He moved with the quiet assurance of someone used to being respected without having to demand it. As he approached the glass-walled office, Lee noticed Dylan the teller watching with obvious curiosity. The young man's expression shifted from interest to confusion, as Huan nodded politely to him before continuing toward the office. Mrs. Thornton opened her office door with a professional smile fixed firmly in place. "Good afternoon, sir. How may I help you?" Huan's face was serious but not unfriendly. "I believe you've been speaking with my wife regarding a deposit issue?" His voice was deep and measured with just a hint of an accent. "Mr. Chen, I presume?" Mrs. Thornton extended her hand. "Patricia Thornton, branch manager. Yes, we were just discussing some security concerns about an unusually large check." Huan shook her hand briefly, then moved to Lee's side, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Is everything all right, Wei?" he asked softly. "Just a misunderstanding," Lee replied with a small smile. The comfort of his presence was evident in her relaxed shoulders. Huan turned back to Mrs. Thornton. "Perhaps you could explain these security concerns to me?" Something in his tone caused Mrs. Thornton to straighten almost imperceptibly. There was no aggression or anger in his question, but it carried an unmistakable weight of authority. "Of course. Mr. Chen, please have a seat." Mrs. Thornton gestured to the chairs, suddenly much more accommodating than she had been moments ago. As they sat down, Lee noticed that the bank had grown oddly quiet. Several employees, including Dylan, were trying to watch the meeting through the glass walls without appearing to stare. "Your wife was attempting to deposit a check for $12,480, Mrs. Thornton began, her tone considerably more respectful than it had been with Lee. "Given the size of the deposit and the nature of her business, our system flagged the transaction for review. Standard procedure in such cases is to place a hold on the funds while we verify the check's authenticity." Huan listened attentively, his expression giving nothing away. When Mrs. Thornton finished, he nodded once. I understand the need for security measures, he said. However, I'm curious why my wife's long-standing relationship with this bank wasn't taken into consideration. Mrs. Thornton shifted slightly in her seat. Well, Mr. Chen, while your wife has indeed been a customer for several years, her typical transaction patterns don't usually involve sums of this magnitude. I see, Huan replied. He turned to Li. Wei, do you have your business documentation with you? Li nodded and handed him the folder of papers she had already shown to Mrs. Thornton. Huan glanced through them, then placed them on the desk. Everything appears to be in order, he observed. The check is from Wong Designs, correct? They're a respected company with an excellent reputation in the industry. Yes, Li confirmed. They ordered a collection of accessories for their autumn showcase. Huan turned back to Mrs. Thornton. Wong Designs has been my wife's client for 3 years now. Their payments have never presented issues before. Mrs. Thornton's smile was becoming strained. Previous payments may have been smaller, Mr. Chen. Our concern is specifically with the amount of this particular check. I understand, Huan said politely. He reached into his suit jacket and removed a sleek leather wallet. From it, he extracted a business card and placed it on the desk in front of Mrs. Thornton. The branch manager picked up the card, and Li saw her eyes widen slightly as she read it. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable, a mixture of surprise and sudden realization. You're Huan Chen of Chen Global Investments? Mrs. Thornton asked, her voice carefully controlled. Yes, Huan confirmed simply. The atmosphere in the room shifted instantly. Mrs. Thornton sat up straighter, adjusted her glasses, and placed the business card carefully on her desk as though it were a precious object. Mr. Chen, I had no idea. This is quite a surprise. Mrs. Thornton glanced between Huan and Li, clearly recalibrating her entire understanding of the situation. Li kept her expression neutral, though a small part of her couldn't help but feel a certain satisfaction at the manager's discomfort. This wasn't about revenge or humiliation. Li had never wanted that. But there was a simple justice in watching someone who had been so dismissive now face the consequences of their assumptions. My wife prefers to manage her business independently, Huan explained calmly. Her success is entirely her own achievement, built through talent and hard work. I respect her wish to keep our financial lives separate where possible. Mrs. Thornton nodded quickly. Of course. That's quite admirable. She reached for her phone. Let me just call our operations manager to expedite this process. As Mrs. Thornton dialed and began speaking in hushed, urgent tones, Huan gave Li's hand a gentle squeeze. His eyes asked a silent question. Are you okay? Li nodded slightly, appreciating his concern. This wasn't the first time they had been in this situation, though it had been a while. Early in their marriage, before they decided on their current arrangement, they had often faced the whiplash of people's attitudes changing once Huan's identity was revealed. It had been one of the reasons Li had chosen to live simply. She valued being treated as herself, not as an extension of her husband's wealth and influence. Through the glass walls, Li could see Dylan watching the proceedings with obvious curiosity. The young teller was leaning over his counter, trying to get a better view of what was happening in the manager's office. Several customers were still watching as well, no doubt wondering about the well-dressed man who had caused such a stir. Mrs. Thornton hung up the phone and turned back to them with an entirely different demeanor. Warm, accommodating, almost fawning. Mr. Chen, Mrs. Chen, please accept my sincere apologies for any inconvenience. We'll process this deposit immediately with no hold period. In fact, the funds will be available in your account right away. Thank you, Huan said with a polite nod. I appreciate your cooperation. Of course, Mrs. Thornton replied, now all smiles. Is there anything else we can do for you today? Perhaps you'd like to speak with our investment advisor. We offer special services for our premium clients. That won't be necessary, Huan replied. We simply want to complete my wife's deposit transaction. Certainly. I'll handle it personally. Mrs. Thornton stood quickly. If you'll follow me, we can take care of this right away. As they rose to follow Mrs. Thornton out of the office, Li couldn't help but notice how differently they were treated now. The same people who had stared with suspicion or pity were now watching with curious respect. The security guard who had positioned himself near Li earlier now stood at attention. Dylan the teller was straightening his tie nervously, but this was just the beginning. What none of them yet realized was that Huan Chen wasn't just a successful businessman in an expensive suit. The true extent of his influence, and what it would mean for this bank, was about to become clear in ways that would leave everyone, especially Mrs. Thornton and Dylan, completely stunned. Mrs. Thornton led Lee and Huan to her personal desk on the main floor. Bypassing the regular teller windows completely, she pulled out a chair for Lee with exaggerated courtesy, then another for Huan. "I'll process this deposit myself," she announced, taking Lee's check with newfound care, handling it as though it were a precious document. No need to wait in line. Dylan the teller was watching from his window, his expression a mixture of confusion and growing concern. He leaned over to whisper something to another teller, who glanced at Huan and then widened her eyes in apparent recognition. Huan sat calmly beside Lee, his presence commanding yet understated. While Mrs. Thornton busied herself with processing the check, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through several messages. "Wei," he said quietly to Lee, "I need to make a quick call. Will you be okay here for a moment?" "Of course," Lee replied with a small smile. Huan stepped away, moving toward the entrance where he could speak privately. Lai watched as he dialed a number and began talking, his expression serious but composed. Mrs. Thornton finished entering the deposit information and printed a receipt. "Here you are, Mrs. Chen," she said, her tone now dripping with deference. "The funds will be available immediately, as I mentioned." "Thank you," Lee said simply. Mrs. Thornton hesitated, then leaned forward slightly. "Mrs. Chen, I want to personally apologize for any misunderstanding earlier. Had I known who you were, who I am hasn't changed," Lee interrupted gently but firmly. "I'm the same person who walked in 30 minutes ago." Mrs. Thornton blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Yes, of course, I simply meant—" "I understand what you meant," Lee said, her voice kind but unwavering. "But I hope you can see why that's part of the problem." Before Mrs. Thornton could respond, Huan returned from his call. His face was serious as he took his seat beside Lee. "Is everything all right?" Lee asked him. "Just some business that needed immediate attention," Huan replied. Then turning to Mrs. Thornton, he asked, "Is the deposit complete?" "Yes, Mr. Chen, all taken care of," Mrs. Thornton assured him with a bright smile. "The funds are already available in Mrs. Chen's account." "Good," Huan said. "Now I believe we should speak with the regional director." Mrs. Thornton's smile faltered. "The regional director?" "Yes," Huan confirmed. "Thomas Wilson. Is he available?" The color drained slightly from Mrs. Thornton's face. "Mr. Wilson is at the downtown headquarters today. I could schedule an appointment for you next week if you'd like." "That won't be necessary," Huan replied, his tone pleasant but firm. "I've just spoken with him on the phone. He'll be joining us via video call in about 5 minutes." Mrs. Thornton's professional composure cracked visibly. "Mr. Wilson is coming on a call now?" "Yes," Huan confirmed. "He was quite interested to hear about our experience here today." For the first time, Dylan the teller appeared truly nervous. He had stopped processing transactions altogether and was watching the unfolding scene with growing alarm. "Perhaps we could use your office for the call," Han suggested. Of course," Mrs. Thornton replied quickly, standing up. "Please follow me." As they walked back to the glass-walled office, Lee noticed that every employee in the bank was now watching them. Word had clearly spread about who Huan was, though she suspected most of them still didn't understand the full picture. Once they were seated in the office, Mrs. Thornton fidgeted with items on her desk, straightening papers that were already perfectly aligned. "Mr. Chen, I want to assure you that customer service is our highest priority at First National Bank. If there's been any misunderstanding—" "There's been no misunderstanding," Huan said calmly. "My wife was treated disrespectfully based on assumptions about her appearance and status. That's not a misunderstanding. It's a systemic failure." Mrs. Thornton swallowed hard. "Sir, I can assure you—" She was interrupted by the chime of an incoming video call on her computer. Mrs. Thornton quickly adjusted her appearance and accepted the call. The face of an older man with silver hair and a stern expression appeared on the screen. "Patricia," he said by way of greeting, his tone businesslike. "I understand we have Mr. and Mrs. Chen with you today." "Yes, Mr. Wilson," Mrs. Thornton replied, her voice higher than usual. "They're right here." The regional director's expression softened slightly when he saw Huan. "Mr. Chen, it's good to see you," though I'm sorry about the circumstances. We spoke briefly at the charity gala last month, though you might not remember. I remember, Juan assured him. You gave a compelling speech about community investment. Thank you, Mr. Wilson replied, seeming pleased. His gaze shifted to Lee. And Mrs. Chen, I've heard wonderful things about your community work. I believe our outreach director mentioned your contributions to the Children's Garden Project. Lee nodded, a bit surprised to be recognized. It's a project close to my heart. Mrs. Thornton looked increasingly uncomfortable, glancing between Lee, Juan, and the regional director with growing confusion. Now, Mr. Wilson continued, his tone becoming more serious. One tells me there was an incident regarding a deposit today. Could you explain what happened, Mrs. Chen? Lai recounted the events simply and factually, without embellishment or accusation. She described the public questioning of her check, the loud announcements about potential fraud, and the insistence on a 2-week hold despite her long-standing relationship with the bank. As she spoke, Mrs. Thornton's expression cycled through discomfort, embarrassment, and alarm. When Lee mentioned Dylan's comments and behavior, Mrs. Thornton closed her eyes briefly as though in pain. I see, Mr. Wilson said when Lee had finished. His expression was grave. Patricia, would you care to explain how this happened in your branch? Mrs. Thornton struggled to find words. There was a system flag. The amount was unusual for the account type. Mrs. Chen has been banking with us for 5 years, Mr. Wilson pointed out. A simple account review would have shown her perfect record. Yes, sir, Mrs. Thornton admitted. In retrospect, we should have handled this differently. Mr. Wilson turned his attention back to Juan. Mr. Chen, I want to personally apologize for this incident. It's completely unacceptable and contrary to everything our institution claims to stand for. I appreciate that, Thomas, Juan replied, but I think there's a larger issue here that needs to be addressed. I agree completely, Mr. Wilson said. What did you have in mind? I glanced at Lee, who gave him a small nod of encouragement. As you may know, Juan began, Chen Global Investments manages a significant portfolio of banking and financial services assets. Mrs. Thornton's eyes widened as the implication began to dawn on her. What you may not know, Juan continued, is that we recently acquired a 15% stake in First National's parent company. The revelation landed like a thunderbolt in the small office. Mrs. Thornton's mouth actually fell open in shock. Outside the glass walls, Dylan and several other employees who had been attempting to eavesdrop looked equally stunned. The acquisition was finalized last week, Juan explained, though the public announcement isn't scheduled until next month. As major stakeholders, we have a particular interest in how the bank operates at every level. Mr. Wilson nodded gravely. I was briefed about the acquisition yesterday. It's one of the reasons I was so concerned when I received your call. Mrs. Thornton looked as though she might faint. Mr. Chen, I had no idea. If I had known... That's exactly the point, Lee interjected gently. You shouldn't need to know who someone is to treat them with dignity and respect. Juan nodded in agreement. My wife chooses to live simply because she values authenticity in her relationships. She doesn't want special treatment based on her connection to me or my company, but that doesn't mean she deserves to be treated with suspicion or contempt. Absolutely right, Mr. Wilson affirmed. Every customer deserves the same level of respect and service, regardless of how they're dressed or what kind of car they drive. He turned his attention to Mrs. Thornton. Patricia, we'll need to have a longer conversation about this incident and its implications. For now, I'd like you to call Dylan into the office. I believe he should be part of this discussion as well. Mrs. Thornton nodded quickly and went to the door, gesturing for Dylan to join them. The young teller approached with obvious reluctance. His earlier confidence completely evaporated. When Dylan entered the office, Juan stood and extended his hand. Dylan, I'm Juan Chen. The teller shook his hand nervously. Sir, I didn't realize. Few people do, Juan replied evenly. My wife values her privacy and I respect that. But I can't respect how she was treated today. Dylan looked at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Mr. Wilson was just explaining that Chen Global Investments recently became a major stakeholder in First National Bank, Mrs. Thornton informed Dylan. Her voice tight with stress, the color drained from Dylan's face. Major. Stakeholder? Yes, Juan confirmed. Which means that, in a sense, my wife wasn't just a customer you were disrespecting today. She's also one of the people who help own this bank. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Dylan looked as though he wanted the floor to open up and swallow him whole. "I don't share this information to embarrass you," Juan continued more gently, "but to illustrate a point about assumptions and appearances. The woman you dismissed so easily has built her own successful business while also helping manage philanthropic initiatives that donate more annually than this branch processes in a month." Lee reached out and placed a hand on Juan's arm, silently suggesting he ease back. Despite everything, she didn't want to humiliate these people the way they had humiliated her. Understanding her gesture, Juan nodded slightly and turned to Mr. Wilson on the screen. "Thomas, we don't want anyone to lose their job over this. What we want is meaningful change," Mr. Wilson nodded firmly. "And you'll have it, I assure you." This incident highlights exactly the kind of issues our customer service retraining program was designed to address. I'd like to invite Mrs. Chen to participate in shaping that program if she's willing. Lee looked surprised at the suggestion. "Me?" "Yes," Mr. Wilson confirmed. "Your perspective would be invaluable, and given your connection to the bank now, it would be entirely appropriate." Lee considered the offer for a moment, then nodded. "I would be happy to contribute." As the meeting continued with Mr. Wilson outlining immediate steps to address the situation, Lee observed the profound change in how everyone now regarded her. The same people who had dismissed her based on her simple clothes and unassuming manner now hung on her every word. It wasn't what she had wanted or expected when she walked into the bank that afternoon, but perhaps some good could come from it after all. Perhaps this could be the beginning of real change, not just at this branch, but throughout the bank's entire system. 6 months had passed since the incident at First National Bank. The early morning sun streamed through the windows of the same branch where Lee had once stood humiliated. Today, however, was entirely different. Lee arranged the last of the informational booklets on the table at the front of the conference room. The space normally used for internal meetings had been transformed with rows of chairs facing a small podium and presentation screen. A banner hung on the wall reading, "Community Financial Literacy Program. Everyone deserves financial dignity." "Everything looks perfect," said a warm voice behind her. Lee turned to see Mr. Wilson, the regional director, smiling appreciatively at the setup. In the months since their first virtual meeting, they had developed a respectful working relationship. "Thank you, Thomas," Lee replied. "I think we're ready for our first session." "Thanks to you, we're more than ready," Mr. Wilson said, gesturing to the materials. "These resources are excellent. Simple, clear information without the usual banking jargon." Lee nodded, pleased with his assessment. The booklets represented weeks of work, distilling complex financial concepts into accessible language. Each one contained practical information about banking rights, building credit, saving strategies, and how to handle difficult situations at financial institutions. "Have you seen the latest survey results?" Mr. Wilson asked, pulling out his tablet. "Customer satisfaction at this branch is up 47% since we implemented the training program you helped design." "That's wonderful," Lee said sincerely. "The staff has really embraced the changes. Indeed, the transformation at the branch had been remarkable." Under Mr. Wilson's direction and with Lee's input, First National had instituted a comprehensive training program focused on equitable treatment of all customers. Regardless of appearance or perceived status, every employee, from security guards to branch managers, participated in workshops about unconscious bias and respectful service. The door opened, and Mrs. Thornton entered carrying a tray with coffee and pastries. Her demeanor had changed dramatically in the past 6 months. Gone was the condescending smile and superior attitude, replaced by genuine professionalism and humility. "Good morning, Mrs. Chen, Mr. Wilson," she greeted them. "I brought some refreshments for before the session starts." "Thank you, Patricia," Lee said warmly. That was thoughtful. After the incident, Mrs. Thornton had faced disciplinary action but kept her position as branch manager. Lee had specifically requested that she not be fired, believing that true change came through education rather than punishment. The decision had proven wise. Mrs. Thornton had become one of the most vocal advocates for the new training program, often sharing the story of her mistake as a teaching moment for other branches. "The first participants should be arriving soon," Mrs. Thornton said, checking her watch. "We have 25 people registered for today's session." That's more than we expected, Mr. Wilson noted with satisfaction. Word is spreading. Lee's community financial literacy program had started as a direct response to her experience at the bank. When Mr. Wilson had invited her to help shape their customer service retraining, Lee had counter-proposed a broader initiative, one that would not only change how bank employees treated customers but would also empower community members with financial knowledge. The sound of voices in the hallway indicated the first participants had arrived. Lee took a deep breath, ready to welcome them. The door opened and people began filing in, a diverse group representing the neighborhood around the bank. There was the elderly couple Lee recognized from the day of the incident, a young woman with a toddler in tow, several teenagers, and a mix of adults of various ages and backgrounds. Lee smiled as she saw the construction worker who had been in line behind her that day 6 months ago. "Welcome, everyone," Lee greeted them. "Please help yourself to coffee and find a seat. We'll be starting in about 15 minutes. As people settled in, chatting and looking through the materials, Lee felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to see Dylan, the teller who had first questioned her deposit. "Mrs. Chen," he said, his expression earnest. "I just wanted to thank you again for this opportunity. I've learned so much working on this program." Dylan had undergone perhaps the most dramatic transformation of all. After the incident, he had written Lee a sincere letter of apology. Rather than dismissing it, Lee had invited him to coffee, where they had a long conversation about assumptions and second chances. When the literacy program was being developed, Lee had suggested that Dylan assist with the research and preparation, giving him a chance to rebuild his confidence and develop new skills. "You've earned it," Lee told him honestly. "Your input on the materials was invaluable. Not many people understand how intimidating banking can be for those who didn't grow up with financial education." Dylan nodded. "I never thought about it that way until everything happened. My parents taught me about money from an early age. I took that knowledge for granted. That's why this program matters," Lee said. "Not everyone has the same advantages or opportunities to learn." As they spoke, the door opened again and Juan entered quietly. He had been traveling for business and hadn't been sure he would make it back in time for the first session. Lee's face brightened when she saw him. "You made it," she said as he joined them. "I wouldn't miss it," Juan replied, kissing her cheek gently. The Tokyo meetings wrapped up early. Mr. Wilson approached to shake Juan's hand. "Perfect timing, Mr. Chen. We're about to get started." Juan had been supportive of Lee's program from the beginning, though he had stayed mostly in the background, allowing it to be entirely her project. His role had been primarily behind the scenes, ensuring that the initiative received proper funding and institutional support at the corporate level. As everyone took their seats, Lee moved to the front of the room. Despite having prepared extensively for this moment, she felt a flutter of nervousness. Public speaking had never been her favorite activity, but the importance of the message gave her courage. "Good morning," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Thank you all for coming to our first financial literacy workshop. My name is Lee Chen, and I'm here today because I believe everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, especially when it comes to managing their money." Lee didn't share the story of her humiliation at the bank. That wasn't the point of today's session. Instead, she focused on the future and the practical knowledge the participants had come to gain. "Many of us feel intimidated when we walk into financial institutions," she continued. "We worry about using the wrong terminology or not having enough money to be taken seriously. Today, we're going to start changing that." As Lee led the group through the first module on banking basics and account rights, she noticed how engaged everyone was. People asked questions without embarrassment, shared their own experiences, and took detailed notes. The atmosphere was one of mutual respect and genuine learning. During a short break, the young mother with the toddler approached Lee. "I can't tell you how much I needed this," she said, bouncing her child on her hip. "Last month, I tried to cash a check for my parents, and the teller made me feel so small when I didn't understand their policy on holds. I left without even completing the transaction." Lee nodded in understanding. "That's exactly why we created this program. Knowledge gives you confidence, and confidence gives you power." Throughout the 2-hour session, Lee watched as people who had entered nervously gradually became more comfortable and assertive, practicing how to ask questions about fees and policies. how to dispute incorrect charges, and how to compare financial products to find the best options for their needs. As the workshop concluded, Mr. Wilson addressed the group. This is just the first of many sessions we'll be offering. Next week, we'll cover building credit and loan applications. We hope to see you all again. People lingered afterward, asking additional questions and thanking Lee for the program. The elderly couple who had witnessed her humiliation 6 months earlier stopped to speak with her. "We were here that day, you know," the woman said quietly, "when they treated you so poorly. My husband wanted to say something, but we were too afraid we'd be treated the same way. That's why this program matters," her husband added. "People need to know they have rights even if they don't have fancy clothes or important titles." Lee smiled warmly. "Exactly. And things are changing for the better." After the last participants had left, Han helped Lee gather the remaining materials. Mrs. Thornton and Dylan were tidying the refreshment area, while Mr. Wilson was on a call discussing expanding the program to other branches. "You were wonderful today," Juan told Lee as they worked. "How do you feel?" Lee considered the question. "Satisfied," she finally said. "Not because of what happened to me, but because something good has come from it. These people will walk into banks now with more confidence. They'll teach their children and friends what they've learned. The ripple effect could help so many people." Juan nodded in understanding. "You've always been able to see the bigger picture." As they left the bank together, Lee glanced back at the building. 6 months ago, she had walked out of those same doors feeling humiliated and small. Today, she left feeling empowered and purposeful. They walked to the parking lot where Juan's luxury car sat next to Lee's modest Honda. Despite their now public connection and the changes at the bank, Lee had maintained her simple lifestyle. She still volunteered at the community garden, still lived in their modest home, and still ran her small business. The only difference was that now she had found a new purpose, helping others navigate the financial world that so many found intimidating. "Dinner at home?" Han suggested as they reached their cars. "Perfect," Lee agreed. "I made dumplings yesterday using my grandmother's recipe." As they drove away, Juan in his expensive car and Lee in her practical Honda, they were, as always, heading to the same destination. Different paths, same journey. Back inside the bank, a new sign had been placed prominently near the entrance. It read, "At First National Bank, we believe everyone deserves respect, dignity, and excellent service. It's not just our policy, it's our promise." Beneath it, in smaller letters, Community Financial Literacy Program, every Tuesday at 10 a.m., all welcome. A simple change, but one that would make all the difference for people like the young mother, the elderly couple, and countless others who would no longer have to feel small when managing their money. For Li Wei Chen, that was the greatest victory of all.